It was surprisingly easy to slip into the house unnoticed. Jacob had to take the long route around the back, quietly opening the door to the basement. The front entrance was out of the question because of the new alarm system, which had been installed thanks to his wife, Layla's insistence. The idea of an alarm had come up countless times before, but Layla had become obsessed with the idea of securing the household, as she often put it, until Jacob had finally given in and set up the system. The alarm setup included every conceivable entrance, from the front door to the windows. Layla had made sure of it, demanding that the garage door have a precise delay, only 10 seconds, on the keypad. When Jacob suggested a longer delay, she dismissed it as ridiculous, saying, "A robber could be in my bedroom in 15 seconds." He teased her, saying, "What? You trying to give your boyfriend a chance to get out the window?" She just laughed it off, returning to her cooking. But it had stuck with him as oddly logical, so he had set the delay to her preference. Naturally, this meant that every time Jacob came home, he'd have to race to enter the code before the alarm sounded. It was more than just a minor inconvenience. It happened frequently enough to make him grumble. One evening, as he disarmed the system for the third time that day, Layla looked at him with a smug smile, pleased with herself. "See, honey? Now we know it's working," she said. But Jacob, methodical as he was, had found a way around the basement alarm. He discreetly rerouted a small, nearly invisible wire through the top of the doorframe, bypassing the sensor entirely. Layla hardly ever ventured down there, and if she did, he doubted she'd even notice the modification. He'd even tested it, making sure all the lights on the panel lit up as they should. The entire setup felt as secure as a military base, with Jacob's own private way in and out. As he slipped inside, Jacob felt the cool weight of a small .22 caliber Beretta pistol, hidden away in his windbreaker pocket. He had no intention of using it unless absolutely necessary, but the feel of it gave him a strange sense of confidence, a readiness. Something was off lately, and he was determined to uncover what was happening. He hadn't voiced his suspicions to Layla. He didn't need her brushing them off or making him feel ridiculous. He had invested years in building their life together, years of trying for a family that never seemed to come to fruition, years of dealing with the unspoken doubts that seemed to linger between them. Jacob had even taken it upon himself to visit a doctor, feeling foolish but determined to know if the issue was on his end. When the doctor laughed and told him his fertility was above average, even cracking a joke about avoiding fully clothed hugs with strange women, Jacob had left feeling slightly humiliated but somewhat reassured. Layla had been the one with all the concerns, yet she'd avoided talking openly about it, preferring to see her own doctor instead, someone she trusted for years, even before they were married. One afternoon, Jacob had spotted Layla coming out of the salon, looking pleased with herself, hair and nails freshly done. She was supposed to be at her doctor's appointment, but there she was, enjoying an afternoon of pampering. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, just chalked it up to coincidence, but the memory resurfaced later as he sat in his garage, mentally replaying every interaction. She'd come home that evening, looking somber, claiming that her doctor had given her bleak news. "There's a slim chance, Jacob," she'd murmured, eyes welling up with tears. "But it's so unlikely." He'd held her close, feeling a pang in his gut, unable to shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. "We'll just keep trying, honey," she told him, her voice sounding almost rehearsed. And that was when Jacob started to keep a closer eye on things. He didn't really suspect Layla of cheating. She was always home when he came in, no mysterious absences, nothing obviously out of the ordinary. But things hadn't been adding up. His mind spun through various scenarios. Maybe she had a gambling problem or even a hidden addiction. Yet her bank accounts were meticulous. Her only splurges were on salon visits and the occasional outfit. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that would raise any flags. But still, the unease wouldn't leave him. It was during one of her long showers that Jacob had taken a chance to snoop through her things. He'd come across a few items he'd never seen before. A small, lacy bag of panties that looked barely practical, a few dresses he couldn't recall her ever wearing. Nothing unusual on its own, but enough to keep his curiosity piqued. It was a habit they had, dressing up and going out occasionally, and she'd wear something new or risque for a bit of fun. But something in his gut told him this time was different. Then he found them. Tucked beneath a pair of folded jeans in the drawer were birth control pills. Jacob felt his face go hot, his mind reeling as he tried to make sense of it. She'd always claimed they were trying to conceive. Why would she need these? The revelation made him dizzy, and he barely composed himself before she emerged from the bathroom, her hair wrapped in a towel, oblivious to his discovery. The impulse to confront her bubbled up inside him, but he forced himself to hold back, reminding himself of a lesson he'd learned years ago about jumping to conclusions. Years ago, back in college, he'd caught his then-girlfriend, Sarah, passionately greeting another man at a party, hugging him tightly and kissing him on the cheek. Fueled by jealousy, Jacob had nearly punched the guy, only to later find out it was her older brother, back from overseas. It had been a brutal, embarrassing lesson, and one that he reminded himself of now, as his suspicions toward Layla mounted. His work as a ranch equipment specialist took him all over the state. He'd spent years designing and installing custom fencing for farmyards, creating structures to help ranchers manage their cattle or keep livestock away from neighbors' properties. His recent job had been particularly enjoyable, working on a sprawling farm owned by a rough but kind man named Ralph Lawson. Ralph's wife, Gloria, had welcomed Jacob warmly, and the two had a daughter, Anna, a spirited young woman who managed to turn heads even in work jeans and a flannel shirt. She seemed to take an interest in him, although Jacob kept things strictly professional, given his marriage. Still, he couldn't deny that he enjoyed the lively conversations and good-natured teasing. Ralph, though a grizzled rancher, had taken a liking to Jacob, offering him an invitation to dinner with his family, which included hearty servings of ham, cornbread, and fresh vegetables from their garden. Jacob felt strangely at home there, as if he'd found a family he didn't even know he was looking for. After dinner, as they sat around the table sharing stories, he found himself confiding in Ralph, sharing bits of his life and even some of his frustrations, though he kept his concerns about Layla vague. Ralph had nodded sympathetically, offering bits of practical wisdom learned over decades of hard work and life experience. He was a father figure Jacob hadn't known he needed, and by the end of the evening, he felt as if he'd known Ralph and Gloria forever. But as much as Jacob enjoyed their company, he knew he couldn't stay. He had to return home to face the nagging doubts that clouded his mind. On the drive back, thoughts of Layla's mysterious pills and her doctor's vague statements haunted him. For all their issues, he'd always thought their relationship was built on trust. Yet here he was, sneaking around like a stranger in his own life. As he pulled into his driveway, Jacob caught himself wondering what he'd find inside, and whether his suspicions would finally have answers. As the days passed, Jacob's mind grew more unsettled. Every time he glanced at Layla, he wondered if there was more going on behind her carefully composed expressions. She continued with her routines as if nothing was wrong, and Jacob tried to play along, acting like he hadn't discovered the birth control pills. But the nagging feeling refused to go away. He knew he had to find a way to either confirm his suspicions or lay them to rest once and for all. It wasn't long before an opportunity presented itself. Jacob's job had him traveling to farms across the region, usually spending a night or two in a motel before heading home. His latest assignment took him even farther, nearly 400 miles out to a remote ranch on the Wyoming border. This time, the work was extensive. Over 5 miles of fencing to install, along with a few large sheds. His employer was Ralph Lawson again, who was expanding the fence around his ranch. Ralph had insisted that Jacob be the one to handle the job, even going as far as to tell Jacob's boss that if he couldn't get him, he'd find someone else. Jacob's boss, delighted with the commission, offered to reinstate him full-time if he'd take the job. The money was hard to refuse, especially with the double commission they promised. Jacob agreed, feeling a strange sense of relief as he packed up for the extended trip. He wasn't running away from Layla, but the time away might give him some distance to think things through. Ralph and Gloria welcomed him like family once again, and this time Jacob got the impression that they'd been expecting him. After discussing the job, Ralph took him on a lengthy tour of the ranch, pointing out the specific areas where he wanted the new fencing. Grazing laws aren't what they used to be, and people get mighty upset when cattle wander into their flower beds, Ralph chuckled, though his tone hinted at the frustration he felt about the encroaching development. It was late by the time they returned to the house, and Ralph insisted that Jacob stay the night. Gloria had prepared a hearty dinner, and after they'd eaten, she invited him to make himself at home. Jacob gladly accepted, savoring the peaceful simplicity of their home. There was a warmth here that he hadn't felt in his own home for some time. As he settled into the guest room, his thoughts drifted back to his conversation with Ralph earlier that day. They'd ridden across the ranch, discussing everything from fencing plans to life's quirks, and it was clear that Ralph viewed him as more than just a worker. In the short time he'd known Ralph, Jacob had come to respect him immensely. He seemed to understand the struggles of a man like Jacob, with a quiet wisdom that only life experience could bring. That night, unable to sleep, Jacob went to the bathroom down the hall. As he passed by Anna's room, he noticed the door slightly ajar, a dim light spilling into the hallway. She lay on her bed, a blanket draped casually over her, but her body sprawled comfortably, one bare arm resting across her chest, stirred something in Jacob he hadn't felt in a long time. He quickly looked away, feeling like he'd trespassed on her privacy. But as he continued down the hallway, he couldn't shake the image from his mind. The next morning, Ralph and Gloria sat him down for breakfast. Anna joined them, her usual flannel shirt and jeans giving her a natural, earthy beauty. Jacob felt his face warm as she offered him a sly smile over her coffee cup, clearly amused by his flustered expression. Gloria didn't miss the exchange, and she raised her eyebrows knowingly, giving Jacob a little grin as she offered him more coffee. The day flew by as Jacob surveyed the property, measuring distances and marking points for the fence. The landscape was beautiful, the wide open fields stretching to meet the horizon. Cattle wandered in the distance, oblivious to the human planning and discussions taking place around them. For a brief moment, Jacob allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to live a life like this, a simpler life, away from the nagging doubts and complexities waiting for him back home. By evening, the work was done, and Jacob prepared to leave, feeling a pang of regret. Ralph and Gloria had become like family to him, and even though it had only been a couple of days, he felt a deep connection with them. Before he could leave, Anna approached him, a curious look in her eyes. "So, you're just going to disappear back to the city?" she asked, a hint of teasing in her voice. Jacob chuckled. "I'd stay longer if I could, but I have things I need to take care of." Anna tilted her head, studying him. "You know, my parents think you're something special. My dad even suggested that I try to rope you in." She laughed, but her gaze held a flicker of seriousness. Jacob's chest tightened at her words. He wasn't used to such directness, and he felt a strange mixture of flattery and guilt. Here was this vibrant, beautiful woman hinting at something he didn't quite dare to acknowledge. But he was still a married man, and whatever was going on with Layla, he couldn't bring himself to betray his vows. "I'm flattered," he stammered, struggling to find the right words. "But things are complicated right now." Anna smiled, giving him a soft nod. "Well, if you ever figure things out, you know where to find me." Her tone was light, but there was a depth in her eyes that suggested she meant every word. The drive back was long, and Jacob's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was leaving something meaningful behind at the Lawson Ranch. As he neared his home, a strange unease settled over him. The house was dark, and he half expected to see Layla waiting up for him. But the stillness was unnerving. To his surprise, the alarm system was disabled. For a brief moment, he wondered if Layla had simply forgotten to set it. But then he saw a flicker of light from the upstairs bedroom window. His gut clenched, and his pulse quickened. He felt his hand instinctively reach into his pocket, where his fingers brushed against the cool metal of the Beretta. He didn't want to believe it, but he knew he had to see for himself. Moving with quiet determination, Jacob entered the house and made his way up the stairs, the dim glow from the bedroom guiding him. He paused at the top, listening for any sound. The only noise he could make out was the faint hum of running water. Someone was in the shower. Steeling himself, Jacob pushed the door open, not knowing what he'd find but bracing for the worst. To his shock, a man sat on the edge of the bed, his back to the door, casually flipping through a magazine. His magazine. Jacob's blood boiled as he took in the scene. He'd imagined a lot of scenarios, But the sight of this man, comfortable and at ease in his own bedroom, was almost too much to bear. Without thinking, Jacob spoke, his voice low and seething. "Who the hell are you?" The man jumped, clearly startled, and turned to face him, wide-eyed. Jacob's breath hitched as he recognized him. Marcus Hall, the manager of the local bank. The same bank where Layla handled their mortgage payments. Marcus was well known around town, a man with an imposing presence and a reputation for ruthless business tactics. "Jacob, wait, this isn't what it looks like." Marcus stammered, his eyes darting between Jacob and the door, a flash of fear crossing his face. But Jacob wasn't interested in excuses. He'd had enough of being deceived. The years of doubt, the birth control pills, the secrecy. All of it boiled over in that single moment. He raised the gun, his fingers steady on the trigger, and pointed it directly at Marcus. "What the hell are you doing in my house, in my bed?" he demanded, his voice trembling with rage. Marcus held up his hands in surrender, the color draining from his face. "Jacob, please, it's not what it seems." But Jacob wasn't hearing it. He didn't want an explanation, didn't need one. All he saw was the betrayal, the lies. Layla's voice broke through his haze as she emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in a towel, her expression one of pure horror as she took in the scene. Layla froze, her face pale as she processed the scene before her. Jacob, standing in the doorway, gun in hand, pointed at Marcus. She looked like she was on the verge of saying something, but no words came. Her wide-eyed stare moved from Jacob to Marcus, and then back again, as if trying to make sense of how this moment had come to pass. "Layla," Jacob said, his voice a barely restrained growl. "What is this? What's he doing here?" She opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. Instead, she backed up slightly, clutching the towel tighter around herself, looking every bit like a cornered animal. Marcus tried to take advantage of the silence, raising his hands higher and forcing a weak smile. "Jacob, let's all just take a breath here, all right? It's not what it looks like." Jacob's gaze remained locked on Marcus. "You don't get to talk. Not now." He took a step closer, still aiming the gun, a dark resolve settling over him. "You came into my house to be with my wife," he said slowly, his tone filled with a cold fury. "And you think you can just talk your way out of this?" Marcus's eyes darted around the room, and Jacob could see the panic setting in. He knew there was no way to escape, no exit that wouldn't take him directly past the armed man standing in front of him. Jacob watched as Marcus's expression shifted from pleading to desperate, his mouth moving as if searching for the right words to defuse the situation. "Jacob, please," Layla finally managed, her voice shaking. "We weren't. It's not like that. I was just taking a shower. We were only talking. At 2 in the morning? While you're naked. You expect me to believe that?" Jacob's voice was growing louder, his anger barely controlled. He felt betrayed, humiliated. Every insecurity he'd ever felt rushing to the surface, fueling his rage. Jacob's grip on the gun tightened. He could feel his heart pounding, a primal urge to act flooding over him. It wasn't that he'd planned this confrontation or even wanted it to escalate this far. But now, standing here, he felt as if he had nothing left to lose. Marcus, sensing the danger, tried a last-ditch effort, rushing forward in an attempt to grab the gun. The movement was unexpected, and for a split second, Jacob hesitated, caught off guard by the sudden shift. But instinct took over, and he fired twice in rapid succession. The shots echoed through the room, and Marcus staggered back, clutching his stomach, before collapsing onto the floor with a groan. Layla's scream tore through the silence, jolting Jacob back to reality. She rushed toward Marcus, her face contorted with terror and disbelief. Jacob watched her, feeling a mix of anger and guilt as he took in the scene. His wife, cradling the man she'd been hiding from him, pleading and crying over his bleeding form. "Jacob!" she shouted, looking up at him with a mixture of horror and betrayal. "How could you? How could I?" he shot back, his voice bitter. "How could you? After everything we've been through, after all these years, you lied to me. You made a fool out of me." She shook her head, her expression shifting to something almost defiant. You don't understand. You never tried to understand me, Jacob. This was never supposed to happen. A laugh escaped him, harsh and humorless. You're blaming me? That's rich, Layla. But even as he said it, he felt an emptiness creep in, a void where his anger had been just moments ago. The weight of the gun in his hand felt heavy, and the enormity of what he'd done began to sink in. He looked down at Marcus, who was groaning softly, his face twisted in pain. Jacob could see that he was alive, but barely, and then something in him broke. He backed away, letting the gun fall to his side, the rage dissipating as quickly as it had come. Layla was sobbing now, alternating between pleading with Marcus and casting fearful glances at Jacob. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm, to think clearly. "You know what?" he said finally, his voice hollow. "I'm done. I don't want to hear another word from either of you." Turning on his heel, he left the room, descending the stairs slowly, his mind numb. The house, once a place of comfort and familiarity, felt alien to him now. The life he'd built here with Layla, all the memories, all the plans, they felt like a cruel joke, a lie that he'd been fed piece by piece. When he reached the kitchen, he paused, staring blankly at the fridge, his thoughts scattered. He opened the door, grabbing a cold beer and a bag of chips from the counter. Mechanically, he made his way to the living room, sinking into the armchair, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. His mind drifted back to the Lawson Ranch, to the warm hospitality he'd felt there, the sense of belonging. Ralph and Gloria had treated him like family, and Anna. He couldn't deny that he'd felt something for her. It was more than just attraction. It was a sense of connection he hadn't felt in years. Sitting there, he realized that he wanted that life more than anything. A life that was real, grounded, free from the lies that had plagued his marriage. The distant sound of sirens interrupted his thoughts. They were coming for him, and he knew he'd have to face the consequences of his actions. But in that moment, he didn't care. Let them come. He'd made his choice, and he'd deal with whatever followed. As the police arrived, he barely moved, watching impassively as they approached. They surrounded him, guns drawn, shouting orders. One officer stepped forward, confiscating the gun from his waistband before cuffing him, none too gently, and leading him out to the squad car. Jacob didn't resist. He felt almost numb, resigned to whatever awaited him. The ride to the station was a blur, and before he knew it, he was sitting across from a lawyer, a short, stocky man with a battered briefcase who introduced himself as Harvey Larson. Harvey looked over the charges with a grim expression before meeting Jacob's gaze. "Well, you've got a serious case on your hands here," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Attempted murder, among other things. This isn't going to be easy to fight." Jacob nodded, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over him. I couldn't take it anymore. They were lying to me. I caught them and, I don't know, I lost control." Harvey sighed, tapping his pen against his notepad. "I understand that, but unfortunately, the law doesn't usually take betrayal as an excuse for attempted murder. We'll have to focus on self-defense, the emotional state you were in when it happened. Maybe we can build a case for temporary insanity." Jacob looked down at his hands, feeling the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He didn't know what he'd expected when he confronted them, but he'd never thought it would end like this. As the days turned into weeks, Jacob adjusted to life in jail, waiting for his trial date. His thoughts often wandered back to the Lawson Ranch, to the life he'd left behind. Ralph and Gloria had called him a few times, expressing their support, and even Anna had sent a letter, a short but heartfelt note that reminded him of what he could have had if things had turned out differently. The trial was drawing closer, and with it, the realization that his life would never be the same. He'd lost everything: his marriage, his home, even his job. The company had let him go, not wanting to be associated with the scandal. He was alone, with nothing but his regrets and a looming sense of uncertainty. One day, as he sat in his cell, he received an unexpected visit. A young woman entered, introducing herself as Lisa Palmer, a lawyer sent by Ralph and Gloria. She explained that they'd put together a team to help him, to give him a fighting chance in court. Jacob felt a spark of hope, grateful for their support, even though he still struggled to understand why they'd gone out of their way for him. Lisa's presence gave him a renewed sense of determination. He knew that he couldn't undo what he'd done, but maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to start over, to build a new life from the wreckage of his old one. With Ralph's support and Lisa's guidance, Jacob prepared himself for the trial, determined to face whatever came next. The trial date arrived sooner than Jacob had anticipated. The courtroom was a mix of familiar faces and strangers, all gathered to witness the events that had shattered his life laid bare for judgment. Layla was there, seated with Marcus, his face still bearing the scars from that night. They sat with a tight, uncomfortable closeness, avoiding Jacob's gaze as he entered the room. Across the aisle, Ralph, Gloria, and even Anna had come to support him, their presence a comforting reminder of the life he'd briefly glimpsed and desperately wanted. Jacob's lawyer, Lisa, was a powerhouse. Young but fiercely competent, she had carefully prepared him for what lay ahead, giving him a strategy to tackle the prosecutor's questions. She'd advised him to be honest, to stick to the truth without embellishments or self-pity. If you want any chance at a fresh start, the jury has to see you as the man you really are, she'd said. Jacob had nodded, feeling strangely calm as she outlined her plan. For the first time in months, he felt like he had something solid to hold on to. The prosecutor opened with a brutal line of questioning, painting Jacob as a dangerously jealous husband who had violently overreacted to an imagined slight. They emphasized the fact that Marcus was unarmed, that he had supposedly been there for a business discussion, and that Jacob had escalated a simple misunderstanding into a near-fatal encounter. But Lisa was prepared. When it was her turn, she stood confidently, asking Jacob to recount, in his own words, everything that had happened from the moment he arrived at the house. Jacob took a deep breath, glancing briefly at the jury. I came home that night after a long trip. I'd been working on a job in Wyoming, setting up fencing for a rancher out there. Ralph Lawson, he said, nodding toward Ralph in the audience, who acknowledged him with a subtle nod. He and his family had been incredibly welcoming, and it was a reminder of the life I wanted to have, simple, honest. He paused, gathering his thoughts. When I got home, everything felt off. The house was quiet, darker than usual, and the alarm was disabled. I thought maybe Layla had forgotten to set it, but then I saw the light in our bedroom window. I went upstairs, hoping I was wrong, hoping I'd find her alone. But when I opened the door, I saw him, Marcus Hall, sitting on my bed, reading one of my magazines, as if he had every right to be there. Jacob's voice grew rough with emotion, the pain of betrayal evident in his words. I'd suspected something was wrong for a while. There were things that didn't add up, birth control pills, the doctor's visits, and other little things that made me wonder if she was keeping something from me. But seeing him there, in my bed, it was like every doubt I'd ever had was confirmed. Lisa encouraged him to continue, her calm gaze giving him the strength to press on. Layla came out of the bathroom, wrapped in a towel. She tried to tell me it wasn't what it looked like, that they were just talking. But I couldn't believe it. They'd both lied to me, made a fool of me, and in that moment, I lost control. Marcus tried to grab the gun, and I shot him. The courtroom was silent, the weight of his words settling heavily over the audience. Jacob could feel the tension in the air, the collective judgment that hung in the balance. The prosecutor seized the opportunity, standing up to emphasize Jacob's supposed overreaction. So, Mr. Lawson, you're saying that you shot an unarmed man because of a misunderstanding? That seems a bit extreme, don't you think? Jacob's hands clenched, but he kept his voice steady. It wasn't a misunderstanding. He was there, in my home, with my wife. They both lied to me, and I reacted. I'm not proud of what I did, but I can't deny the anger I felt. Lisa took back control, her voice measured and calm. Mr. Lawson, let's talk about the impact of that betrayal. You've been married to Layla for years, trusted her, built a life together. How did it feel to have all of that shattered in a single moment? Jacob's voice softened, the anger replaced by a raw, aching sadness. It felt like my whole life had been a lie. I thought I knew her, thought we had something real. But standing there, seeing them together, it was like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I didn't know what was real anymore. Lisa let his words sink in before turning to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, betrayal can push people to do things they wouldn't normally do. Jacob Lawson isn't a violent man. He's a hardworking, decent person who was pushed to the breaking point by the people he trusted most. What he did was wrong, but in that moment, he was a man overwhelmed by emotion, not a cold-blooded attacker. The jury looked thoughtful, a few of them exchanging glances, clearly affected by Jacob's account. Then it was Layla's turn to testify. She took the stand, her demeanor cold and detached, as if she were speaking about a stranger rather than the man she'd shared a life with. She denied any romantic involvement with Marcus, claiming that they had only been meeting for business reasons and that she had simply been freshening up in the bathroom after a long day. The prosecutor presented Layla's testimony as evidence of a misunderstanding, painting Jacob as a husband who had jumped to conclusions and acted out of irrational jealousy. But Lisa was ready. She had gathered evidence that painted a different picture, a collection of emails and text messages between Layla and Marcus, some of which hinted at more than just a professional relationship. The messages were subtle but suggestive, enough to cast doubt on Layla's version of events. When Jacob's turn came to speak again, Lisa encouraged him to address the jury directly, to tell them what he hoped they would understand about his actions. "I'm not asking for sympathy," Jacob began, his gaze steady as he looked at each juror in turn. "I know what I did was wrong. I let my emotions get the better of me, and I made a choice that I can never take back. But I need you to understand that I wasn't acting out of jealousy. I was acting out of heartbreak. I thought my marriage was built on trust, on loyalty. And when I found out that wasn't true, it felt like I'd lost everything." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know that I'm not a monster. I'm a man who made a mistake, who was pushed to his breaking point by betrayal. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I just wanted the truth." The jury deliberated for hours, and when they finally returned, Jacob felt as if he were holding his breath, waiting for the outcome that would determine his future. The judge read the verdict aloud, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom. "On the charge of assault, we find the defendant, Jacob Lawson, not guilty. On the charge of attempted murder, we find the defendant, Jacob Lawson, guilty of reckless endangerment with mitigating circumstances." A wave of relief washed over Jacob. It wasn't a full acquittal, but it wasn't a life sentence either. He would face penalties, but he wouldn't be spending his life behind bars. As the courtroom began to clear, Ralph and Gloria came up to him, embracing him warmly. Anna hung back, her eyes filled with something Jacob could only describe as hope. He looked at her, feeling a sense of gratitude and longing he hadn't expected. He knew he still had to face the consequences of his actions, but he also felt a glimmer of possibility, a chance to rebuild his life from the ground up. The days that followed were a whirlwind. The court assigned Jacob to community service, along with a probation period and a restraining order preventing him from contacting Layla. He lost the house, which went to Layla in the settlement, but he no longer cared. It felt like shedding a weight, a symbol of the life he was finally ready to leave behind. After fulfilling his legal obligations, Jacob returned to Wyoming. Ralph had invited him back to work on the ranch, offering him a chance to start over. Jacob accepted eagerly, feeling a sense of peace as he made the long drive west, leaving the wreckage of his old life behind. When he arrived, Anna was waiting for him. She greeted him with a warm smile, and in that moment, Jacob knew he was home. There was a quiet understanding between them, an unspoken promise of new beginnings. They didn't need to rush. The bond between them was strong enough to withstand time. As they worked side by side on the ranch, Jacob felt the bitterness and regret begin to fade. He had been through hell, but he had come out the other side, scarred but whole. He didn't know what the future held, but he was ready to face it, one day at a time. The months that followed were some of the most peaceful of Jacob's life. Working on Ralph and Gloria's ranch became more than just a job. It was a way of healing, a path to finding himself again. Days on the ranch were physically demanding, yet each task felt purposeful, anchoring him to the present moment and helping him move forward, one step at a time. Jacob's past felt like a distant storm he had survived, and the ranch was his shelter, a place where he could rebuild from the ground up. Anna was often by his side, helping with everything from mending fences to feeding cattle. They shared an easy companionship, one that didn't require explanations or labels. She was kind and grounded, with a warmth that reminded Jacob of what he had been missing for so long. She had a way of understanding his silences, of knowing when he needed space and when he needed company. It was something he hadn't realized he was longing for until it was there. Their relationship deepened over time, growing from friendship into something more profound. It was a slow, steady connection, free of the complications that had once plagued Jacob's life. With Anna, he felt he could be himself without the need to hide or pretend. There was no resentment, no painful history to haunt him. She became his closest confidant, the person he could trust with everything, even the parts of himself he hadn't been able to share with anyone else. Ralph and Gloria treated Jacob like a son, fully embracing him into their family. Ralph's quiet wisdom and steady presence were a balm to Jacob's soul. He learned from Ralph in ways that went beyond ranch work, picking up bits of advice that only a lifetime of experience could offer. Gloria, with her unending warmth and gentle humor, filled the gaps in Jacob's heart where family had once been. They were patient with him, never prying, allowing him to heal at his own pace. He could feel their support, a silent encouragement that reassured him he was exactly where he needed to be. One evening, after a long day of work, they all gathered around the table for dinner. The smell of roast lamb and freshly baked bread filled the room, and the laughter flowed as easily as the food. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jacob laughed without reservation, his heart light as he soaked in the comfort of this newfound family. As the evening wore on, Ralph cleared his throat, catching Jacob's attention. "Jacob," he began, his voice serious but warm, "Gloria and I have been talking. You've been here for a while now, and we're mighty glad you stayed. We wanted you to know that we're here for you, in whatever way you need." Jacob nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "I appreciate that, Ralph. I can't thank you both enough for everything you've done for me." Ralph smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Well, there's one more thing. If you're open to it, we'd like you to stay on the ranch, permanently. We need someone we can trust to help with the work, and your family to us now. Think of this place as your home." Jacob felt a wave of emotion wash over him, gratitude mixing with a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. "I'd be honored, Ralph," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. I don't know what I'd do without you all." As the night wound down, Jacob found himself sitting alone on the porch, watching the stars twinkle in the vast Wyoming sky. Anna joined him, sitting close, her head resting on his shoulder. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the night, the soft rustling of leaves, the occasional lowing of cattle in the distance. After a while, Anna spoke, her voice soft. "Jacob, do you ever think about what's next? About us?" He took a deep breath, looking down at her. "I do," he admitted, his heart pounding. "I've thought about it a lot. And I know I don't want to lose what we have here. I want to be with you, Anna. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want it to be with you." She smiled, reaching for his hand. "Then that's enough for me." Their relationship blossomed slowly, free from the pressures that had once weighed on Jacob's life. It wasn't rushed or forced. It grew naturally, like the land around them. They became partners not only in life but in work, supporting each other in every way possible. Over time, Jacob found himself becoming more integrated into the ranch's operations. Ralph taught him the intricacies of managing livestock, planting crops, and running the business side of the ranch. Gloria passed on her cooking secrets, teaching him how to prepare meals that rivaled any he'd ever tasted. He even began learning the finer points of ranch finances, ensuring he could contribute fully to the family's livelihood. Anna was always by his side, and together they became the backbone of the ranch, taking on more responsibilities as Ralph and Gloria eased into retirement. The ranch thrived under their care, expanding its operations and even adding a new wing to the main house to accommodate their growing family. Years passed, and Jacob found himself content in a way he hadn't thought possible. He had a family, a purpose, and a place he could call home. The pain of his past, while never entirely gone, had faded into a distant memory, replaced by the warmth of new beginnings. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Anna turned to him, her eyes bright with excitement. "Jacob, there's something I want to tell you," she said, her hand resting on her stomach. "We're going to have a baby." Jacob felt a surge of joy unlike anything he'd ever experienced. He pulled her close, unable to contain the smile that spread across his face. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. She nodded, her own eyes shining. "Yes, Jacob, we're going to be parents." In that moment, Jacob felt his world shift. The years of heartache, the trials he'd endured, they all faded away, replaced by a profound sense of purpose. He looked at Anna, his heart swelling with love and gratitude for this life they had built together. As the months went by, they prepared for the arrival of their child, their excitement growing with each passing day. Ralph and Gloria were thrilled, already doting on their future grandchild, and the entire ranch seemed to come alive with anticipation. Jacob took on every task with renewed vigor, determined to create a legacy for his family, a place where they could grow and thrive. The day their child was born was one of pure joy. They named him Samuel, and he was perfect, with his mother's bright eyes and his father's quiet strength. Holding his son in his arms, Jacob felt a completeness he had never known before. He knew that this was the life he had always been meant to live, a life filled with love, family, and a sense of belonging. Years later, Jacob would often think back on the path that had led him here. He would remember the pain and betrayal, the mistakes he'd made, and the trials he'd faced. But he would also remember the kindness of Ralph and Gloria, the steadfast support of Anna, and the way their love had pulled him out of the darkness and into the light. In the end, Jacob found peace, not in forgetting his past, but in embracing it as part of the journey that had brought him to this place of happiness and fulfillment. His life was far from perfect, but it was real, and it was his. And as he watched his son take his first steps on the land they called home, Jacob knew he had finally found everything he'd ever wanted. The ranch would be his legacy, a testament to the power of resilience and the strength of family. In the quiet of the Wyoming night, as he stood with Anna by his side and his son playing in the fields, Jacob felt a deep, unshakable peace. He was home at last, surrounded by the people who loved him, in a place that held all the promise of new beginnings and the healing power of love. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories on the channel.